In the village of Oloma, where the huts leaned slightly as if bowing to time, and the sun painted dust and gold, there lived a girl named Nyana. 17 rains had passed over her head, and though her voice was soft and her eyes carried the quiet of rivers, her hands told stories no tongue could match. They were small hands, quick, nimble, and scarred, but whatever they touched was made whole. If a calabash cracked, Nyana could seal it with resin so fine you'd think it had never broken. If a mother wept over a collapsed roof, Nyana would arrive with palm branches and ropes, and by dusk, the home would stand prouder than before. The villagers started to say she wasn't born with hands, she was born with tools. Some said the spirits of the soil whispered into her knuckles. Others, more fearful, claimed she was possessed, but not by anything dark. No, they whispered behind calabashes and folded mats that she had been kissed by the builder below, a forgotten deity who shaped the first huts before men ever spoke. Nyana herself said nothing. She only worked. She lived alone, in a small hut by the termite mound, a place most children feared. Her parents had died when she was 5, disease, hunger, no one quite remembered, but Nyana had survived. The village women tried to take her in, but she always wandered back to that little hut, fixing it with her own small hands, patch by patch. It began with simple repairs. But soon, she was making things no one asked for, altars with curves like rivers, healing dolls from clay and ash, even charms that soothed restless infants when worn around the neck. Once, she carved a chair so balanced it could stand on one leg and not fall. Another time, she touched a goat's swollen udder and it shrank back to health. She was born with blessing in her fingers, old Koba murmured, watching her from his doorway. But others didn't find it so beautiful. The elders began to frown. Fewer people were coming to them with problems. Fewer donations were left at the temple. Even the high priest's door had begun to rot, and he'd waited 3 days for a repairman, only for Nyana to fix it without a word in the dead of night. She thinks she's above tradition, hissed Elder Muwake. She builds too well, snapped Elder Tana. Even the gods might grow jealous. The fear that started as whispers soon took root. What if she wasn't just building for the living? What if her hands worked for something else? One evening, a hunter stumbled upon her near the edge of the sacred grove, a place no one entered without ritual. She was kneeling beside a tombstone, her hands dancing across the cracked surface of the stone like spiders over silk. It was the grave of Abiaoru, a warrior whose name had long been buried beneath shame. They said he'd been cursed for betrayal. His tomb had been left broken for years, a warning to children not to dishonor their clan. But Nyana didn't flinch. She cleaned the crack with oil, used ground bones and clay to seal it, and finally pressed both palms against the stone. That night, she slept deeply, deeper than she had in months. And in her sleep, she dreamed of bones. They were not frightening. They did not rattle or chase. They stood in a line, rib cages glowing faintly, skulls bowing in the dark. One stepped forward. "You gave me a name again," it said, in a voice like shifting gravel. "And hands remember kindness." Nyana awoke before dawn, her body shivering with cold though the hut was warm. Her hands tingled. And beside her bed, she found something strange, a small stone sculpture of her, carved perfectly, with her hands lifted as if in prayer. She hadn't made it. By midday, the village had heard. "She went to the cursed tomb," someone said. "She spoke to bones," someone else added. "They say she's building for the dead now," muttered a child, his mother silencing him with a slap. And so the stories began to twist. At night, people claimed to hear the sound of hammering, though no one worked past sunset. Women woke to find tiny altars beside their doors, built of sticks and feathers, shaped like the faces of ancestors long gone. Nyana said nothing. Her hands kept moving. She still fixed the broken, still carved beauty from rot, but now, villagers watched her with both reverence and terror. Some left offerings at her doorstep. Others made signs to ward off spirits when she passed. She was no longer just Nyana. She was the girl whose hands remembered the dead. At first, the elders tried to ignore her. They hoped the fear would pass like a strong wind, stirring things briefly but leaving nothing broken. But Nayana's hands did not stop. In fact, their work grew stranger, more precise, more revealing. It began with the old well. It had been sealed for generations. A cracked, moss-covered ring of stone at the edge of the village, where children were warned not to play and even goats avoided grazing. No one remembered why it had been closed, only that bad spirits had once dwelled there. One morning, Nayana stood by it, her hands smeared with resin and dust. She said nothing, offered no explanation, but began scrubbing away the moss. She replaced the broken stones, sealed the outer rim with clay, and poured blessed water over its lip. By evening, the rope had been tied, and the pulley grown back to life. When the bucket dropped, it hit something soft, then caught. The first draw brought up water. The second brought bones. Small bones. Tiny. A child's. The village fell silent. Then someone screamed. The elders gathered, claiming it was a wandering animal. But Nayana, quiet, unblinking, had already lined the bones in a perfect row on a woven mat outside her hut. Wrapped in cloth. Buried with care. No words. No accusations. Only the truth laid bare. Then came the mask. An old woman named Isha, blind in one eye and half mad from grief, brought Nayana a broken ceremonial mask. It had belonged to her husband, she said. She wanted to hang it in the shrine for remembrance. Nayana, as always, took it without question. She worked on it all night. When she returned the mask, its colors were vibrant again, the cowrie shell teeth perfectly aligned, the carved cheeks gleaming like wet stone. But the moment Isha touched it, she screamed. She screamed and fell to the ground, clawing at her own skin, muttering names that hadn't been spoken since the famine, names of people who had vanished. Amend. Siko. Duma. They were buried under the yam field. I saw them. I saw them. She was dragged away, foaming at the mouth, raving that the mask had spoken to her, that the wood remembered. The villagers were shaken. Something was wrong. And the elders? They were terrified. She's unearthing silence, Elder Tana spat, pacing the council hut. She's disturbing what we buried. She's making us visible to the dead, whispered Elder Muake. What else has her hands touched? She is digging at the village's spine, said the priestess grimly. And the spine is rotten. The chief, a heavy man named Obu, did not speak immediately. His face was stone. But deep down, he felt it too, the ground trembling beneath old secrets. So they called her. Nayana arrived barefoot, her hands covered in flecks of ochre. She looked tired, but not frightened. Chief Obu dismissed the other elders and gestured for her to sit. Nayana, he said, his tone almost fatherly. The village is grateful for your gifts. You have built what no man could. She nodded once. But we are a fragile people, he continued. Our history is complicated. Some things are better left untouched. Let the past sleep. Nayana tilted her head. I don't wake the past, she said softly. It wakes itself. Chief Obu forced a smile and reached beneath his robe. From a goatskin pouch, he poured out gold cowries, gleaming in the firelight. More than Nayana had ever seen. Stop building, he said. Just for a while. Let things settle. Nayana looked at the cowries for a long time. Then she stood, walked to the doorway, and without turning back, she said, My hands are not mine. They build what calls them. And she left. That night, the wind changed. Villagers swore they heard whispers under their beds. Dogs refused to bark. Fires wouldn't stay lit. In Nayana's hut, something stranger was happening. She had fallen asleep with a bowl of dust by her side, used for smoothing carvings. But her hands were not asleep. They moved slowly, deliberately, as if listening to music only they could hear. With no tools, no eyes, no commands, they began to scoop the dust. And sculpt. Shapes emerged, delicate, eerie. A rib cage. A face with hollow eyes. A child's foot. The next morning, Nyan awoke to find them on the floor beside her mat. Not finished, but familiar. They were fragments. Echoes. Pieces of the hidden dead. When she picked them up, her fingertips pulsed. And she knew. The silence in the village had never been peace. It had been fear, nailed down, stone-lidded and sealed. But fear is not death. It lives. It waits. In her hands, the hands everyone had once loved, were now the carpenters of its reckoning. The sky was still the color of coal when the drums began. Not the drums of joy, nor of mourning. These were different, slow, deliberate, like a heartbeat dragged through thorns. Every villager knew them. The drums of purification. People stirred from their sleep, pulled shawls over their shoulders, and crept toward the village square. No one spoke, not even the children. At the center of the square, lit by torches that made the dawn retreat in shame, stood the elders, robes heavy with ancestral beads, eyes shadowed with what they would call duty. And between them, on her knees, was Nyana. Her wrists were bound with rope made from twisted vine. Her face was swollen from the blows they'd delivered before dawn. A trail of blood ran from her temple to her neck, but she made no sound. Her eyes were not wild. They were still, like a pot of water just before it begins to boil. The chief stepped forward. His voice rang out, loud enough for the hills to hear. "This is not anger," he said. "This is order. This is the cleansing of rot from root." The villagers shifted uneasily, some blinking back tears, others clutching charms. "She was warned," said Elder Tana. "And yet she built with hands that do not listen. She summoned the silent. She disturbed the ground where silence slept. She called the dead," added Elder Muake. "And they answered. This is witchcraft. This is danger." A few villagers turned their faces. One woman wept openly, but no one stopped what was coming. Chief Obi raised a machete, long, rusted, its edge worn with time. "Let this be a lesson," he said. "Let this be the end of her hands." Nyana did not scream. Even when they forced her forward, face pressed into the earth, even when two men held her down, even when the machete rose into the sky, she did not beg. And when the blade came down, swift and brutal, once for each wrist, her body jerked, but her voice remained a ghost in her throat. The sound of flesh splitting from flesh was swallowed by the horrified silence of the crowd. Blood sprayed onto the earth. Her hands, those miracle makers, lay twitching in the dust like fish pulled from water. The men stepped back. The elders stood unmoving. One of them, perhaps it was the priestess, kicked the severed hands into a raffia basket and tossed them into the nearby bush, where the vines swallowed them greedily. Nyana collapsed. Her stumps pulsed with open veins. Blood pooled beneath her. She should have died then. She should have gone quiet like a flame doused in rain. But she didn't. She lifted her head, lips cracked and trembling. The people leaned in, afraid, expecting a scream, a curse, a scream of rage. But Nyana simply looked at them all. Her eyes passed over each face, the butcher who'd once asked her to mend his daughter's shoes. The girl she'd helped during the rains, when her roof had caved. The mother whose baby she'd healed with a carved wooden charm. And then, through lips wet with blood, she whispered, "The hands remember." She said nothing more. The elders turned their backs. The villagers drifted away. And by the time the sun had fully climbed the sky, only the flies kept her company. They left her there, in the dirt, stumps wrapped roughly with rags, her body broken. But she did not die. That night, a fog crawled over the village, thick and low. The kind of fog that made people lock their doors and refuse to look out their windows. Even the dogs, usually howling or barking at wind and shadow, fell silent. Not one of them went near the square. The patch of earth where Nyana had bled still smoked faintly, as if the ground itself had taken in her pain and now whispered it back into the air. Those who dared to pass swore they saw 2 indentations in the dirt, where hands once lay. And though no wind blew, they swore they saw the ash spiral, as if shaped by fingers that were no longer there. Nyanna should have died. Her blood had soaked too much earth, her body too weak, too hollow. But something, whether pity, fate, or a calling older than memory, kept her soul tethered to breath. When night fell again over the village, and her body still lay barely stirring near the square, something came for her. A figure in black robes, stitched with bones so small they looked like teeth. His face was hidden beneath a hood, and though the torchlight flickered across the trees and grasses around him, he cast no shadow. He stood over Nyanna and did not speak. She blinked once, twice. She saw no feet beneath his robes, only dust spiraling upward as if the ground itself bowed to him. She should have screamed. But pain had drained every emotion. All that remained in her was a dull, pulsing emptiness. He reached down and touched her forehead with a finger as cold as river stone. Her body seized, not in pain, but in stillness. And then, they vanished. No one saw them leave. No footprints marked their trail. Even the blood-stained earth where she had lain began to dry and fade. Deep in the forest, past where the trees bent unnaturally and the air grew cold without wind, he led her. Past roots twisted like ribs, through thickets where no bird sang. Then, the cave. Its mouth was narrow, gaping like a wound in the hillside. Bones marked its entrance, skulls, ribs, vertebrae, carved into the stone, arranged in spirals, patterns, signs no living tongue remembered. Inside, it was not dark. A cold blue light pulsed from within the walls, veins of memory, perhaps, lighting the carvings that lined every surface. Stories in bone. Names scratched into fossil. Moans rose not from echoes, but from the stone itself. The stranger moved without sound. Nyanna followed, her legs trembling, barely attached to will. Then she saw them. Her hands. Lying on a stone altar, exactly as they had fallen, but no longer lifeless. They moved, slowly and with intention, as if weaving something only they could see. Tiny shrines lay before them. Made of bone fragments, feathers, soot. Intricate. Reverent. They were building. Nyanna felt her knees, breath stolen. The stranger finally spoke. His voice was both inside her and around her. Like wind under water. Like memory. You once built for the living, he said. Now build for us. Nyanna looked at the hands, her hands, dancing, shaping, blessing the dust with purpose. Tears rolled down her cheeks. Not from fear, but from something deeper, the unbearable ache of knowing that part of her, the best part, had been ripped away, and yet, it still chose to move. I have nothing left, she whispered. No arms. No place. No name they will speak. You have will, the stranger said. And the dead answer will. They do not need arms. They need voice. Purpose. Shape. Nyanna looked again at her hands. One of them had finished a tiny altar, and it turned toward her, fingers outstretched. She reached with her stumps, clumsy, painful, and the hand touched her forehead. In that moment, she saw everything. Children buried beneath yam fields. Wives stoned and forgotten. Warriors cursed and sealed in silence. She saw the bones in the ground aching to be remembered. She saw stories unfinished. And she saw what her hands could build, not for the living anymore, but for those who had been denied their resting shape. I will build, she said, voice cracking but sure. Let my hands go where they must. The stranger bowed once. Then vanished. From that night forward, Nyanna no longer needed arms. Her hands floated, graceful, silent, moved by something beyond sinew or muscle. And Nyanna spoke. She guided them. With her voice, she sculpted bone. With her breath, she blessed shrines. With her grief, she gave the dead a home. In that cave, surrounded by the remains of the forgotten, she found a new calling. Not to fix what was broken, but to build what had been buried. It began with a single whisper. A boy, no older than 6, woke in the middle of the night to the sound of tapping outside his window, soft, methodical, as if someone were building a tiny house with a tiny hammer. He peeked through the cracked wood slats and screamed so hard he lost his voice for 3 days. When his mother came running, she found him shaking under his bed, pointing out the window with wide, silent eyes. There, perched on the ledge, was a small clay doll, its limbs made of bird bones, its chest painted with soot. Its hands were open, palms facing upward, as if waiting to be filled. The next day, 3 more families found similar dolls on their rooftops. And that was only the beginning. By the end of the week, the village was in chaos. At night, people began hearing scratching, not rats, not wind, but a deliberate etching, like fingernails across dried wood. When they woke, they found names carved into their doors. Names of the dead. Some were recent, elders' forgotten wives, outcast children, vanished lovers. Others were old, names no one dared to say anymore. Names wiped from record and memory. And then came the graves. The bush behind the village, long overgrown, began to shift. Mounds of dirt moved where no feet had walked. By moonlight, villagers saw something slithering, not snakes, not animals, but hands. Severed hands, crawling without arms, moving with eerie grace. One dug. One stacked bones. One carved. By dawn, 3 old graves had been opened. Bones had been cleaned, arranged, and left on woven mats, as if waiting for someone to claim them. The elders tried to hide it. Dogs, said Elder Muwake. Hyenas. Mischief. But they could not explain the structures. Behind the chief's hut, a shrine had appeared overnight, a dome of skulls, perfectly balanced, marked with ash and feather. The bones were old, brittle, polished as if lovingly cleaned. When the guards tried to destroy it, their machetes shattered. Axes split in 2. The next morning, the shrine stood untouched, but now, it had grown. A second layer of skulls had been added. And someone had written across the ground in powdery white bone dust. We remember. Panic swallowed the village. Some tried to flee, but the paths out of Oloma were thick with fog that never lifted. One man ran all night and returned by morning, confused, barefoot, and shivering. He swore he had walked straight, but the land had bent around him. The mothers clutched their children. The fathers sharpened spears that would never strike. And all the while, Nyanna's hands worked. They were seen, glimpsed, but never caught. One would hover in the trees, dropping pebbles near a stream until they formed the shape of a ribcage. Another would disappear behind a hut, only to emerge dragging a bundle of old hair tied into a noose. They never attacked. They never touched the living. But they built. And what they built could not be undone. A hut collapsed, and by morning, was rebuilt, not with thatch, but bone and red clay. A child smashed one of the bone dolls, and the next day, dozens appeared around his bed in perfect rows. The whispers began soon after. Not everyone could hear them. Only some. Elder Tana heard it first. She woke to voices outside her window, soft, familiar. Tana, they called. You said we died of fever. But it was you who shut the gate. It was you. She stumbled outside, shaking, swearing she saw faces in the dirt. She screamed for the priestess, but the priestess was already in her own terror. Her cooking fire refused to burn. The walls of her hut bled smoke that spelled one word, Isha. Isha, the madwoman they'd buried alive for speaking too much after touching the mask. The priestess collapsed. Soon, the whispers came every night. The guilty couldn't sleep. They paced, muttered, drank bitter herbs, prayed to idols they no longer believed in. One man poured palm oil across his doorstep, begging whatever spirits hovered in the air to spare his family. He awoke to find handprints in the oil, hundreds of them, crawling up his walls. Still, no curse was spoken aloud. No plague. No blade. Just the hands, building, etching, stacking, unearthing. Children began playing games with them, laughing, chasing shadows at dusk. But when they picked up the bone dolls or touched the carvings, they froze. Their smiles vanished. One girl whispered to her mother, "They say the ground is full of stories. And Auntie Nyanna's hands are the only ones brave enough to write them down." The mother slapped her. But that night, she too found a doll on her roof. Its face was carved to look exactly like her. The village was unraveling, not through war or sickness, but through memory. Through the terror of being seen. Through the unshakable knowledge that what had been buried refused to stay buried. And somewhere, deep in the forest cave, Nyanna knelt in the dust, blindfolded, her voice steady. Around her, her hands floated, obedient, eager, tireless. She spoke slowly, softly, and they moved. "Here," she whispered, "a shrine for the stillborn. Use feathers, not stone. Here, a cradle for the girl beneath the well. Let her bones be washed. Here, the names that need remembering." And across the village, the carvings spread. The whispers thickened. And the dead began to sing. The sky above the village thickened like curdled blood. For weeks now, the air had hung heavy, like something waiting to fall. But that morning, something finally did. A child screamed near the old millet field. Her father rushed to her, expecting a snake. But she pointed to the cracked soil, where pale white fingers had broken through the earth like sprouting roots. A human hand, dry and ancient, clutched a bone knife. Then another hand emerged beside it. Then an entire skull. Graves open without picks or shovels. They open like mouths yawning in hunger. In the eastern burial grounds where the old warriors were laid, the soil shifted like water. Skulls pushed their way up, and bones followed, ribs, spines, weapons long buried with them. But they did not rise in chaos. They assembled. They rose with order. At night, the wind changed. People said it moaned, said it knew names, said it tapped at windows like a visitor too polite to enter uninvited. But no one opened their door. And then came the dreams. They started with the children. A boy named Ekula began to cry in his sleep, calling out for his dead grandfather who'd vanished during the famine years. When his mother woke him, his eyes were open, but he would not speak. Just stared. And in the morning, he had drawn something on the hut wall with his fingers dipped in ashes, a face with no hands and eyes that bled clay. The dreams spread like fire. Men screamed and tore off their clothes in the night, claiming they saw Nyanna standing over their beds, her mouth sewn shut, her hands missing, yet still building something in the corner of their room. One woman ran into the river at dawn, saying her dead sister had whispered a name to her. The one who took her voice. She never returned. In the village square, the chief summoned a diviner to read the winds. The diviner wept before he spoke. The dead are not just angry. They are organizing. That same night, a thick fog rolled in. When it cleared, the square had changed. Where the well once stood was now a tall post of skulls bound with reeds and bone thread. Balanced on top, a black doll made of clay, head tilted sideways, its empty eyes staring at the chief's hut. The old executioner, the one who had brought down the blade on Nyanna's wrists, began to shout the next morning that he couldn't see. "I can feel the sun," he cried, "but everything is darkness." On his door, someone had etched a message in bone dust. "You took what she gave. Now take what you gave." The people begged him to leave the village. He made it only as far as the footpath by the hills. That's where they found him, mouth stuffed with clay, hands wrapped in his own clothing like a parody of what he'd done. The elders met in secret after that. There were only 6 left now, the others had disappeared or fallen silent. Elder Beso, the loudest of them, declared it was still Nyanna's witchcraft. "She's not dead. Her spirit is in league with the devils below. We must find the cave. Burn it. Seal it." But the others were quiet. Especially Elder Nduku, who hadn't spoken since her dreams began, dreams filled with faces she had ordered buried during the Harvest Rebellion. She knew the faces. She remembered their cries. One by one, the villagers began hearing the same voice in their sleep, not loud, not terrifying, just a whisper. You built your peace on the bones of others. And now the bones were building themselves into something new. They came not as ghosts but as a silent procession. At the edge of the forest, villagers began to see them, figures of bone and ash, wrapped in old shrouds. They did not float. They walked, one step at a time, with spears made of wood and ribs, masks carved from the skulls of hyenas, and shields stitched from the skins of those who once betrayed them. Some of the dead wore crowns of wire and thorn, kings who'd been forgotten. Some dragged farming tools, their bodies hunched but their eyes bright with hunger. They came in lines. Hundreds. Maybe thousands. Some barely visible. Some tall as trees. Some with no faces at all. In the center of the procession were the two severed hands, Nyanna's hands, now blackened with clay and blood, leading the way like sacred birds in flight. They moved in patterns no one could understand, pausing sometimes to draw symbols in the dust, to tap the door of a hut and wait. And wherever they tapped, someone inside would begin to scream. The village tried to pray. They called on gods they hadn't worshipped in years. They lit fires in the old shrines. But the fires blew out, as if exhaled by something larger than wind. The storm broke on the fourth night. Lightning cracked the baobab tree near the square, splitting it clean down the middle. Rain poured like it wanted to cleanse history itself. And still the dead marched. Nyanna, deep in the cave of bones, did not speak anymore, not with her voice. But her eyes glowed, and the bones around her obeyed. Behind her, the walls of the cave now pulsed with life. Carvings moved. Bone statues leaned forward. Clay pots wept red sap. She stood, arms empty but spirit full. She was no longer the girl they butchered. She was the architect of remembrance. The builder of reckoning. And she was not alone. As the dead reached the village outskirts, the winds carried a final warning, one every child heard as they covered their ears. She gave you what your hands could not build, peace, shelter, healing. Now her hands return to take what yours destroyed. And then, silence. But the ground kept shaking. The first tremor came just after the rooster's second crow. A low rumble rolled beneath the village of Duma like thunder inside the soil. Earthen pots shook. Sleeping goats stirred. Children sat upright in their beds, clutching thin blankets to their chests. Then silence. But it wasn't peaceful. It was the silence that came before the world chose sides. When the sun rose, it rose to a different Duma. No one had to go to the edge of the village to see it, the bones were everywhere. Skeletons lined the horizon in rows, each one standing taller than the last. Some wore crumbling soldier masks from centuries ago. Others were clothed in fragments of burial cloths, their sockets glowing faintly with a smoky light. And they weren't just standing still. They were watching. But what struck the villagers dumb, what made even the boldest hunter fall to his knees, was what lay in the village square. A monument, taller than any hut, was rising with its own will. No hands touched it, not visibly. But it built itself, piece by piece. Bones, big and small, clicked into place with mechanical precision. Vertebrae stacked like pillars. Skulls nestled like ornaments. Ribs curved into arches. And above it all, woven through the structure like veins, were strands of Nyanna's hair, once cut from her head, now sacred threads guiding the form. Her floating hands moved through the air like silent craftsmen. Each one knew its task. One sculpted symbols into femurs. Another placed children's bones like holy relics in alcoves. One stitched dried sinew to bind the joints of the great tower. The villagers dared not touch it. A boy who tried to throw a stone screamed as the stone stopped midair and embedded itself in his palm. When his mother tried to help, her fingers bent backwards. She didn't scream. She just stared at the monument, her lips trembling. By noon, the earth shook again, but this time, it wasn't just the ground. The elders were dragged out of their huts. Not by people. Not by hands. but by ropes of braided hair that slithered across the dirt like serpents. Screaming, they clawed at the soil, but it did not soften for them. One by one, they were thrown before the monument. Elder Jotsi, who ordered Nayana's punishment. Elder Shumo, who sharpened the blade himself. Elder Deka, who spit on her as her blood ran. Even Elder Yogo, the one who said nothing, silence, it seemed, was its own kind of guilt. The villagers watched from behind their doors, behind their children, behind their trembling hearts. And then the monument changed. It opened. Like a flower of bones, it unfolded, revealing chambers inside. Rooms sculpted not of wood or mud but of history, blood-written murals carved in ivory. Each chamber was shaped like a cage. And inside each one, a story, a girl bound in the square, a tomb split open, a shrine burning. The floating hands grabbed the elders by their feet and pulled them in. They screamed, kicked, cried for forgiveness. But the monument was not moved by mercy. One by one, they were sealed inside, not crushed, not pierced, not torn, just sealed. Trapped in silent cages of the bones they tried to bury. And the wind began to sing. It passed through the monument's hollows like breath through a flute. But the song was not a melody, it was memory. Voices whispered through the air, "She fixed my roof when I had no father. She carved my mother's gravestone when no one came to her burial. She taught me to heal with clay, and now my baby breathes." I watched them cut her hands. The monument's song grew louder, and suddenly, everyone could hear the truth. Not the truth from mouths. The truth from bones. All across the village, the dead began to glow. In graveyards. Under huts. In the trees. The chief, who had not shown his face all morning, was found locked inside his own hut. Or rather, what had been his hut. It had transformed overnight. Bones of animals now reinforced its frame. The floor had turned to polished skulls. His bed had become a sarcophagus, soft on the outside, solid as stone beneath. And the doorway, where the path once led out, was now a wall. No handle. No hinge. No escape. The chief's last scream came at dusk. It was not a scream of fear. It was a scream of realization that everything he had buried him back. That night, the village dared not sleep. They gathered in the square, not speaking, not blinking. And there, in the heart of it all, floated Nayana. Not her body, no. That had long been surrendered to the spirits. But her voice. It echoed through the monument, through the bone shrine, through every soul that had once called her cursed. "You built your power on silence," the voice said, "neither soft nor loud, but everywhere at once. On the backs of the forgotten. On the bones of the good." The hands hovered beside her voice, gentle now. They made no move to strike. "I built with love. You punished it." The wind bent the trees. The dead do not forget the hands that raised them. And with that, the monument sealed itself, not like a tomb, but like a temple. A place of truth. Forever. No one ever touched the bone monument again. It loomed in the village square like a frozen scream, silent, but always listening. Each night, the wind passed through the ribs and skulls woven into its height, and it sang. Not a song of joy, but of memory. The kind of song that made even the strongest elders pull their blankets tighter, muttering forgotten prayers to gods who had long stopped answering. The villagers no longer swept the square. Grass did not grow there. Shadows stayed longer than they should. At the monument's base, one could sometimes see fresh bone, as if the monument was still being built, fed by something unseen. And no one ever asked how. Nayana's name was never spoken, not even in whispers. Instead, children were taught to trace her initial in the air with invisible fingers, a trembling end shaped like the curve of a broken wrist. It was said if you mouthed her name, the air would still. If you shouted it, your tongue might blister. People built their homes carefully now. No more crooked beams, no more careless nails. The roof had to hold, the walls had to stand. Because if you built in arrogance, or cut corners, strange things might happen. You might wake up to find your house disassembled, the parts laid out in front of your door like a lesson. Or worse, reassembled in a different shape. A cage. A coffin. A confession. Her severed hands were now legend, spirits, myth, guardians. Some called them the weavers, others the floating mothers. But most simply called them the hands. They moved without warning, unseen but always felt. They mended broken tools for the humble, sealed secret passageways for the guilty, and carved warnings where lies festered. A boy who kicked over a beggar's bowl woke the next morning with his own hands bound in vines. A merchant who cheated a widow found his house built into a circle, no doors, no windows, only silence. And a woman who lied in court about her neighbor's field woke up to find a shrine of her own bones standing at her bedside, her future, carved before it arrived. Only one thing was constant, the hands never harmed without reason. They only revealed. They only built what should have been seen all along. People began to leave small gifts at the edge of the square, not to worship, but to thank. A jar of clay. A bundle of twine. A child's drawing, showing two hands holding up the moon. Offerings to the memory of a girl whose only crime was to build too well, too truthfully. Even the dogs learned to tread lightly near the square. The crows perched silently along the rooftops when the wind shifted. And when a person died suddenly or unjustly, a fall, a beating, a hidden poison, the villagers would wake to find the ground already dug, the body buried with honor, and a mark left in chalk on the door, a handprint. Sometimes, these handprints glowed faintly in the moonlight. As the seasons passed, children were raised on stories, not of war or conquest, but of building. The village elders were replaced with makers and midwives, potters and poets. They taught that the most sacred act was to create something useful, and the most dangerous act was to bury the truth under stone. A generation later, no one remembered the names of the elders who condemned Nayana. But they all remembered the hands. If a house creaked too loudly, people would pause and ask, "Is something hiding here?" If a tool broke in the middle of a task, they'd whisper, "Was this made with care?" And if a child asked who built the monument, their mother would lean close and say, "A girl with no hands, but with more power than all who tried to silence her." There were still nights when the village slept uneasy. Nights when the wind moaned like breath through bone. When clay pots cracked without cause. When the moon hung red above the square. On those nights, even the boldest warriors dared not speak aloud. They simply traced that invisible N in the air, and waited. Some say Nyana's spirit watches still. Some say her hands, now worn smooth by time, continue to move beneath the earth, building chambers the living will never see. And some say that when the last lie is finally told, when the final injustice is buried, her voice will rise one last time in the wind and whisper, "Build better, or be buried by what you hide." Until then, the monument grows. Quietly. Patiently. Bone by bone. Far from the village where the bone monument grew, in a dusty market square of another land, a girl cried out beneath the sky. She was young, barely 15, accused of stealing a piece of bread, the crust still clutched in her trembling fingers. She hadn't eaten in 2 days. Her lips were cracked. Her eyes wide. No one listened. The punishment was swift. Her hand was taken with a machete dulled by too many wrongs. Blood soaked the earth. No one looked twice. They left her near the edge of the village, tossed like garbage beside the cassava fields. The villagers muttered prayers, not for her, but for themselves, hoping whatever spirits might watch would spare them for watching and saying nothing. That night, the earth broke. Softly, at first. A rumble beneath her curled body. Then a cracking, like bones splitting beneath soil. And then they came. 2 hands. Weathered. Familiar. Pale as ash and laced with dust. They rose from the earth without a body, gliding on tendrils of black mist. They moved with knowing, not just of what had been done, but of what had been buried. They hovered above her stump, and from nowhere, conjured silk. Thick, soft, red as old memory. They wrapped her wound. the girl didn't wake. She only stirred. Her tears had dried. Her body stilled. In her dream, she stood in a great field of bone shrines, stretching beyond the sky. Each shrine pulsed like a heartbeat. And from behind one, a woman with no hands stepped forward. Nyanna. Her voice was the wind, full of soil and sorrow and steel. "I have many hands now," she said, as she reached out with light. "And I'll remember." The girl nodded, though she did not understand. Not yet. By dawn, the field outside the town held a new shrine. Not made by human hands, but by those that do not forget. A circle of bones. A hand carved from bark and ash. A truth no one could ignore. And across the continent, shrines began to rise. In forests. In deserts. On palace steps. Beneath orphan beds. Wherever truth was buried, her hands broke the ground. And built again.